Hello and welcome back. Get yourself comfortable. Pull the blanket up, sort out your pillow, whatever you need to do. We're not in any hurry tonight. I've been thinking about what to do for this one for a while actually. There are so many directions you can take with The Walking Dead. You could do a full retrospective on the whole run. You could go episode by episode through a single season. You could spend an hour just talking about Daryl Dixon and his crossbow, and probably not scratch the surface. But what I keep coming back to, especially late at night when the brain starts connecting things it wouldn't normally connect, is the quiet stuff. The things the show planted early on and never fully explained. The mysteries that got introduced in season 1 and are still technically unanswered even now. The decisions characters made that the show treated as settled, but that actually raise more questions the longer you think about them. So that's what we're doing tonight. 11 seasons of The Walking Dead, 177 episodes, more spin-offs than I can keep track of without checking a list. And somewhere inside all of that, the show left behind things it never quite picked back up. Some of them were deliberate, some of them feel like the writers got interested in something and then got distracted and moved on. And some of them are the kind of thing where you're not entirely sure whether the show knew what it was doing or whether it stumbled into something more interesting than it realised. Just briefly, in case you've wandered into this one without much Walking Dead background, the show ran on AMC from 2010 to 2022. It follows a group of survivors in a world where the dead have reanimated. Sheriff's deputy Rick Grimes wakes up from a coma in an empty hospital, discovers the world has ended while he was unconscious, and spends the next 11 seasons trying to keep his family and his people alive. Along the way, there's Daryl, who became one of television's most unexpectedly beloved characters, despite the fact that he barely spoke for the first 2 seasons. There's Carol, who starts as an abused housewife in the background of the frame, and ends as arguably the most dangerous person in the entire story. There's Negan, who arrives in season 6 with a barbed wire baseball bat and a philosophy about power that the show spends years arguing with. And there are walkers, that's what they call the dead in this world, everywhere. Now, if you're already a Walking Dead person, all of that is old news. You know the show. What we're here for tonight is the stuff underneath it, the whisper at the end of season 1 that changed everything, the French connection that the show introduced and then quietly forgot about, the moral argument that the show kept having with itself across 11 years without ever fully resolving it, the woman in the prison who burned 2 people to death and whose reasoning the show never properly adjudicated. If you're not already subscribed and you want to hear more evenings like this one, it really does help if you subscribe down below. It's free, it takes about 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss these when they come out. But now, let's get into it. Let's get into The Walking Dead. One more thing before we do. I've tried to organise tonight in a way that flows naturally, rather than feeling like a checklist. We'll move from the show's biggest secret outward, through the moral arguments it kept having with itself, through the characters who carried those arguments on their backs, and into some of the smaller mysteries that the show planted and left unresolved. You don't need to have seen every episode. You don't need to take notes. If your eyelids get heavy somewhere in the middle, that's entirely the point. The show will still be here, and so will the questions. The place to start, I think, is the moment that recontextualized the entire premise of the show. Not a death, not a betrayal, not one of the big set pieces, just a handshake. A man pulling another man close and whispering something in his ear before staying behind to die. It happens at the end of season 1. The group has found the CDIC building in Atlanta, which is still running on a backup generator and staffed by a single scientist named Dr. Edwin Jenner. They get inside, they get cleaned up, they eat a proper meal for what feels like the first time in months, and then Jenner shows them around the facility and eventually shows them something that changes everything. A brain scan labelled TS19 of someone who was infected and allowed to die and reanimate in a controlled environment so the process could be documented, and then the building starts counting down to its own destruction because the generator is running out of fuel and the protocols are automatic, and Jenna has more or less accepted that this is the end. Rick talks him into letting them go. Jenna opens the doors. Most of the group makes it out, and just before Rick leaves, Jenna pulls him close and says something that the camera doesn't let us hear. Rick looks shaken. He nods, and they part ways. The show doesn't tell you what Jenna said for almost an entire season. Season 2 opens with the group on the road, searching for a missing child, doing the difficult work of surviving in a world that is actively trying to kill them. And the secret sits there in the background of the story, unaddressed until the final episode of Season 2, when a young man named Randall dies. Here's the thing about Randall. He dies from a broken neck. He has no bites, no scratches. He was not infected in any way that the group could detect. And he comes back anyway. He reanimates. He becomes a walker. And Rick, standing there watching it happen, says the thing quietly, almost to himself. Jenna said we all carry it. Whatever it is, we all carry it. And there it is. The whisper at the CDC wasn't a piece of tactical intelligence. It wasn't a map to another facility, or the location of a safe zone, or a warning about a specific threat. It was the most fundamental fact about the world the show takes place in. Everyone who dies, regardless of how they die, will reanimate. The infection, or whatever you want to call it, because the show is deliberately vague about what it actually is already inside every single living person. You don't need to be bitten to become a walker. You just need to die. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think people absorb this fact and move on from it fairly quickly, but it's genuinely one of the stranger premises in modern television, if you actually think about it. The apocalypse in The Walking Dead is not technically a zombie apocalypse in the traditional sense. It's not a virus spreading through bites or through the air or through contact with the infected. It's a fundamental change to the nature of death itself. Death now means reanimation. Every human being who dies everywhere on the planet comes back as something that resembles them but isn't them. And the show introduces this fact and then doesn't really stop to examine what it means, which is either a storytelling choice or a missed opportunity, depending on how you look at it. I lean toward thinking it was a missed opportunity, personally, but the questions it leaves behind are fascinating. When did this start? Was there a specific moment when the nature of death changed for the entire human species, simultaneously? Because if so, something caused that. Something changed, globally, at the same time, in a way that affected every living organism in a specific taxonomic group. That's not a disease spreading through a population. That's something else, something the show never names and never explains. Jenna himself, when the group asks him what he thinks it is, gives an answer that's more honest than most people notice. He says he doesn't know what it is. He doesn't know if it's a virus, a fungus, a bacteria, a prion. He doesn't know if it's natural or man-made. And then, when Jackie asks if it could be divine punishment, he doesn't dismiss it. He pauses. He says he doesn't rule it out. And that's the last theological conversation The Walking Dead ever has about its own premise, despite the fact that the premise is, depending on your perspective, either a public health crisis or a cosmological event. The group's reaction when Rick reveals what Jenna told him is interesting too. They're furious mostly. Glenn is hurt. Carol asks why Rick didn't tell them sooner. Rick says he didn't know if it was true, and now he does because of Randall. But the fury doesn't last long, because it can't. There's nothing to be done with the information. You can't protect yourself from it. You can't treat it or cure it or inoculate against it. All it changes is the protocol when someone dies. You have to make sure the brain is destroyed before the body reanimates. What it does change, in a more lasting way, is the meaning of the walkers themselves. Because if every living person is already carrying whatever this is, then the walkers aren't an alien threat. They're the next stage. They're us after death. The walkers and the living are the same species at different points in the same process, and the only thing separating them is a heartbeat. The show sometimes seems to be aware of this and sometimes doesn't. There are moments across 11 seasons where characters engage with the walkers in ways that acknowledge their former humanity, putting down a neighbour, encountering someone they used to know. And there are moments where the walkers are treated as purely external, purely enemy, in ways that feel slightly at odds with the biology the show established in the very first season. The thing I keep coming back to, though, is the question of timing. If everyone already carries the infection, if death itself has been redefined, then that redefinition had to start somewhere. There was a first day, a first moment, and the show introduces a clue about where that might have begun in a line that gets spoken once and never followed up, the French Connection, which is where we're going next. But before we do, there's one more dimension of the universal infection that I think is worth sitting with, because it changes the emotional register of the whole show if you let it. The characters in The Walking Dead spend a lot of time being afraid of walkers. That's natural. Walkers kill people in this world constantly. The fear is rational, but the characters also spend a lot of time looking at walkers with something that's harder to name, a kind of sick recognition, a discomfort that goes beyond the mechanical danger. There are scenes across many seasons where survivors stop mid-action and look at a specific walker for a moment longer than the tactical situation requires. A child's shoe, a familiar jacket, the remains of a haircut someone had done before any of this. If the walkers are external, if there's something that happened to the world from outside, then these moments of recognition are about loss, about grief, about the world that used to exist and the people who used to be in it. And that's one way to read them. But if the walkers are internal, if every person in that world is carrying the mechanism of their own eventual reanimation inside them, has been carrying it all along, will inevitably express it at death, then those moments of recognition are something more unsettling. They're the living looking at their own futures. The walker isn't just what someone else became, it's what every person in the frame will become. It's the self later. It's the destination. The show never articulates this quite this directly. It lets it sit in the background of the image. But the universal infection, if you take it seriously, means that the survivors aren't fighting something external to themselves. They're fighting the world's insistence on what they're going to be. Every day they stay alive is a day they've resisted the thing they're already carrying. And that's a different kind of story than a monster story. That's something closer to an existential one. There's a practical consequence of the universal infection that the show handles in one of its more quietly effective Season 4 storylines, which is the flu that sweeps through the prison. A respiratory illness spreads through the cell block. People die from it. And the disturbing thing is how quickly a conventional illness becomes an apocalyptic threat once you understand the universal infection, because anyone who dies from the flu of any cause is going to reanimate. So a flu outbreak in an enclosed space isn't just a medical crisis. It's a reanimation crisis happening in slow motion, inside the walls, among people who trust each other. The protocol the group develops, quarantine, watch over the sick, be ready to act the moment someone dies, is the universal infection's logic applied to everyday illness. They can't treat the flu as something they just wait out, with the understanding that most people will recover and the ones who don't will have a funeral. Every death from any cause is now a conversion. The barrier between illness and reanimation is no longer a bite, it's a stopped heart. This is the universal infection doing something to the story that a simpler zombie mythology doesn't achieve. It means the group can never fully lower their guard with each other. They have to be ready, always, for the people they love most to become the thing they most need to defend against. Not because those people would choose that, but because everyone is, at the cellular level, already the enemy they're trying not to become. The show doesn't dwell on this, doesn't make speeches about it, but the prison flu arc is the clearest moment where the universal infection stops being backstory and starts being daily operational reality. Let me tell you about Edwin Jenner, because I think he's one of the most quietly tragic figures the show ever created, and he gets 3 episodes. When the group arrives at the CDC, Jenner is alone. He's been alone for a while. The other scientists left when they decided survival outside the building gave them better odds than staying. He doesn't blame them for going. He stayed because of a promise he'd made to his wife. She'd been infected early in the outbreak and had asked him to stay as long as he could, to keep working, to keep trying. Her name never gets said on screen. She's TS-19, the test subject, the brain scan he shows the group. She agreed to be documented through the reanimation process so that the data would exist, so that something of her death would be useful. And Jenna, working alone in a building designed for teams of researchers, has been trying to honour that, recording into a camera each day, continuing the experiments, doing what he can. He's been there for 194 days since the outbreak started, 63 of those days since it went global. What ended the research wasn't giving up. It was an accident. He was working with tissue samples, the TS-19 samples, the last ones he had, and he knocked a cylinder of corrosive fluid onto the Petri dish. An automatic decontamination protocol activated. He watched from behind safety glass as the lab and everything in it, including the last tissue samples that might have told him something useful, were destroyed. And then he sat down, drank the rest of the available wine, and decided to die. That was before the group showed up. That's the state of things when Rick's people knock on the door. Now, the part I want to focus on, the part the show plants and then completely abandons, comes during the scene where Jenna explains what he knows about the infection. He tells them about the other research facilities around the world that the CDC was in contact with. All of them lost power eventually, one by one, as the world fell apart and the infrastructure maintaining their generators failed. And the last one to go dark, the last facility to lose contact, was in France. He mentions it almost in passing. A single line. The French facility held on longer than anyone else. And then he adds something that I've thought about more times than is probably healthy. They got further than anybody. That's all he says. They got further. And then they lost power too. Further? How? Further toward what? The show never answers this. France is mentioned once in the 6th episode of the first season, and then it's gone. The French connection is the most significant, unexplored thread in the entire mythology, because it's the only hint in the main show's run that anyone, anywhere, made meaningful scientific progress on understanding what happened. There are a few possibilities for what Jenna meant, and none of them are small. If the French facility got further toward understanding the origin of the infection, whatever change in biology caused the dead to reanimate, that's information that could have changed everything. Understanding why it happened is the first step toward understanding whether it could be reversed. Not the reanimation of the dead, necessarily, but the underlying change in human biology that made reanimation possible at death. Alternatively, if the French facility got further toward a treatment or a vaccine, not a cure for someone already infected, since everyone is already infected, but some kind of intervention that might disrupt the reanimation process at death, then the stakes of their power going dark are even higher. They might have been close to something that would mean the world's survivors could eventually die without coming back, which is, when you think about it, the single most important thing that could happen in that universe. The expanded universe, the novels set in the Walking Dead world, specifically The Rise of the Governor and the comics' companion material, gives a bit more texture to this. There's a suggestion in some of that material that the reanimation mechanism involves something neurological that gets activated by the infection in a very specific way, and that the French researchers were getting close to mapping that mechanism. But the television show doesn't borrow from this, doesn't reference it, and leaves the French thread completely cold. I don't think this was a mistake exactly. I think the writers knew they'd planted a thread they couldn't fully pursue, and they made a choice to keep the show's focus on the human drama rather than the scientific mystery. That's defensible, but it means the show's mythology has a gap at its centre. The most important question the premise raises, what caused this and can it be undone, gets the barest gesture toward an answer, and then nothing. What we do know is what Jenna knew, which was less than the French. He knew the infection existed in everyone. He knew it activated at death. He knew it targeted the brainstem, enough to get a body moving, not enough to restore the person who'd been there before. He knew he couldn't identify whether it was natural or man-made, and he made a decision at the end not to tell the group all of this. He told Rick, he whispered it. He didn't address the group as a whole, didn't make an announcement, didn't leave notes, which raises the question, what else did Jenner know that he took with him when the building came down? He'd been working alone in a fully equipped research facility for months. He had access to everything the CDC had compiled about the infection, every sample, every scan, every data point, before the accident destroyed the last of the TS-19 samples. He had the decontamination footage. He had almost certainly conclusions and hypotheses that never got written into a formal report because there was no one to send a formal report to. He told Rick one thing, one sentence. He might have known a dozen things he didn't say. There's a version of the story where Jenner knew exactly what caused it, had a working theory, and chose not to share it because he genuinely believed it didn't matter. He believed humanity was finished. He believed the outbreak was an extinction event. And if you believe the species is done regardless, the origin story becomes academic. You don't tell a man who's lost his house what caused the fire, because knowing won't get him his house back. That might be the most honest reading of Jenner's silence. Or it might be that he simply ran out of time, that the building was counting down, and there was too much to say, and he chose the one thing that was most immediately useful to Rick's group going forward. We can't know, and the show, true to form, never tells us. What I find most interesting about Jenner, and this is where the casual late-night brain really starts going, is the line about divine punishment. When Jackie asks if he thinks this could be the wrath of God, he doesn't laugh. He doesn't reach for the scientist's default dismissal. He says he doesn't rule it out. For a man who has spent every day since the outbreak in a laboratory, who has been surrounded by equipment and data and the methodologies of empirical research, to not rule out divine punishment is either the statement of someone whose faith has survived his circumstances or someone whose science has run out of answers, maybe both. And that's the last time the show engages with that question in any meaningful way. For a story set in what is, depending on your theological outlook, either a public health catastrophe or the literal wrath of God, Walking Dead is remarkably uninterested in the theological dimension of its own premise. One line, one scientist, one moment of honest uncertainty, and then the building explodes. What's worth thinking about before we leave Jenner entirely is what it meant for Rick's group to leave the CDC the way they did. They arrived with hope, the last real institutional hope remaining in the story. There was a building, a scientist, equipment, the infrastructure of a response. They left with nothing except the knowledge that everyone they'd been with was already carrying the thing that would eventually kill them in the specific way the world now killed people. That knowledge is not nothing. As we discussed, it changed protocols and it changed the meaning of every death going forward. But it's a very particular kind of knowledge. It tells you what is, not what to do about it. The show's survivors, after the CDC, are people who have been told the full dimension of their situation and had every institutional possibility of a solution removed simultaneously. The CDC was the last place. There was no other building they could drive to after that. And the show, this is something I genuinely admire about its early seasons, doesn't try to replace it with another false hope immediately. The group drives away from the burning building and keeps moving, not toward anything specific, because specific destinations that promised safety had now been thoroughly disproved twice. What they move toward instead is each other, the community they can build in the absence of any external rescue, which is, quietly, the whole show. Jenner gave them that, not intentionally, not as a gift. He gave it to them by being the last brick wall, the last place where institutional rescue could have happened, the last moment where the old world's machinery might have provided an answer. when it didn't, when he stayed in the building and it came down and there was nothing left, the survivors stopped looking for the rescue that was coming and started building the life they had. That's not a small thing, and it all started with a handshake and a whispered sentence. I want to talk about Shane Walsh for a while, because I think Shane is one of the most underrated characters in the show's entire run, and I say that as someone who watched him do things that are genuinely difficult to defend. He's not a good person. I'm not going to argue that he's a good person. But I do want to argue that he understood his world more clearly than almost anyone else in the story, and that the show spent 11 years quietly proving him right, while treating his memory as a cautionary tale. For context, Shane Walsh is Rick Grimes' best friend and partner. They worked together as sheriff's deputies. When the outbreak started, Rick was in hospital in a coma, and Shane visited him, tried to get him out, couldn't, and eventually left believing, probably correctly, that Rick was going to die there. He found Rick's wife Laurie and their son Carl. He kept them alive. He led them to a camp outside Atlanta where survivors had gathered. He protected them, organised the group, made decisions. He fell in love with Laurie in the months he thought Rick was dead, a fact that becomes enormously complicated when Rick turns up alive at the end of season 1. Shane's central problem from that point forward is that he cannot reconcile the world he's now living in with the moral framework he grew up with. And he's right that they're incompatible. He just goes about resolving that incompatibility in ways that cost him everything. The argument Shane makes, and he makes it explicitly in several conversations, is that the rules of the old world no longer apply. That the cost of holding on to pre-apocalypse morality is paid in lives. That survival requires a willingness to make decisions that would have been unthinkable before, and that the people who can't make those decisions will get other people killed. He believes this sincerely. It's not rationalization for his own behavior, or not only that, it's a genuine philosophical position that the events of the show keep vindicating over and over again in ways the narrative seems almost reluctant to acknowledge. The clearest example is the Randall situation, which comes toward the end of season 2. The group captures a young man named Randall, a member of a larger and demonstrably dangerous group of survivors. They can't keep him indefinitely. They can't integrate him safely. They can't let him go because he knows where their camp is. The ethical debate about what to do with him splits the group. Dale argues for sparing him, for preserving their humanity, for not becoming the thing they're fighting against. Shane argues for killing him and getting it over with. Rick can't decide. The debate drags on, costs time and emotional energy, and eventually Dale is killed by a walker, not because of the Randall debate directly, but in a way that feels like the show's commentary on the cost of extended moral deliberation in a world that doesn't pause for it. And then what happens? Rick kills Randall. He doesn't do it the way Shane would have. The show makes sure there's a distinction there, but he does it. And then, over the next several seasons, every member of the group who argued for restraint in that situation ends up making exactly the same kind of decision Shane advocated, under roughly the same circumstances, with roughly the same reasoning. Glenn, who is defined by his goodness and his hope, kills people when he has to. Maggie does. Herschel, the most morally serious character in the early seasons, eventually accepts that the world requires what it requires. Even Rick, who was so opposed to Shane's worldview that their conflict became the emotional engine of season 2, ends up commanding a community that makes Shane-level decisions as a matter of operational necessity. The show understands this, I think. There's a line Rick says in season 3, after they've secured the prison. That's as close as the show gets to acknowledging what Shane was arguing. He says something to the effect that they've been doing things they've had to do, things they never thought they'd do, and they've been surviving. The show doesn't name Shane in that moment, but it could have. What Shane got wrong wasn't the diagnosis. The diagnosis was correct. The old moral code is incompatible with survival in this world. What he got wrong was the prescription. His solution was to strip everything down, to become purely operational, to excise the emotional connections that he saw as vulnerabilities. And the show's counter-argument, not made explicitly, but demonstrated repeatedly across 11 seasons, is that those connections are actually what makes survival worth pursuing. That the point of staying alive is the people you stay alive with. That a world organised purely around Shane's principles isn't worth surviving into. What I find genuinely hard to shake, though, is that the show's counter-argument doesn't actually contradict Shane's core observation. Rick becomes what Shane was trying to become, a man who does what has to be done, while holding on to what Shane abandoned, which is the people. The synthesis isn't a refutation of Shane, it's a refinement. There's a specific image from Season 2 that I think of as the physical embodiment of the Shane versus Rick debate, and it's Herschel's barn. Herschel has been keeping walkers in his barn, people who used to be his neighbours, his wife, people he knew. He hasn't been able to bring himself to destroy them because he still believes, genuinely and without delusion, that a cure will be found and they'll come back. He's wrong, as it turns out. But the barn is the show's clearest image of what holding onto the old world's assumptions costs. The walkers are in there. They're a danger. They need to be dealt with. And they're not being dealt with because someone who loves what they used to be can't bear to accept what they are. Shane is the one who opens the barn. He forces the confrontation that everyone else was avoiding. The group has to deal with it then and there, in the worst possible way, in front of everyone, with Sophia emerging last and Rick having to do what needs to be done. Shane was right that the barn couldn't stay closed. He was wrong about almost everything else. But that moment, the barn, the confrontation, the cost of the delay, is the most honest argument the show ever makes for Shane's position. Sometimes the thing everyone is pretending not to see is the most dangerous thing in the yard. And then there's Judith. Judith Grimes is born at the end of Season 2. Her mother dies in childbirth. She is raised by Rick as his daughter. She inherits his name, his values, his way of seeing the world. By the show's final seasons, she is one of its most compelling presences, careful, perceptive, moral, in a way that feels earned rather than imposed. And she is, genetically, Shane's daughter. Laurie and Shane's relationship while Rick was in hospital, and the question of who fathered Judith, is one of those things the show raises, and then somewhat quietly lets be. Rick knew, by Season 3, that there was a real question about Judith's paternity. He chose to love her as his own, anyway, completely, without reservation, and the show ultimately frames that choice as one of the most important things he ever did. But sit with the genetics for a moment. The child who comes to embody everything Rick believed in, compassion, community, a future worth building, was fathered by the man who argued most forcefully that those things were luxuries the world couldn't afford. Judith Grimes is the synthesis the show was looking for all along. Shane's biology, Rick's philosophy, and the 11 seasons of experience between. The walking dead as they should be. Not the corpses that roam the roads, but the living who carry everyone forward. I don't know if the writers intended that reading. It might be too neat. But the show planted it, and the show never denied it, and those are usually the best kinds of theories. But let me go a bit further with Shane because I think the conversation usually stops before it gets to the most interesting part. Shane dies in the Season 2 finale, killed by Rick in the woods. It's a fight that had been building for most of the season. Two men who care about the same things, organised around incompatible methods for protecting those things. Rick kills Shane, and then Carl kills the walker that Shane becomes. And the show frames this as the end of a conflict, a resolution, with Rick walking back toward the group, carrying the weight of what he's done. What the show doesn't fully sit with is what comes next. Because Season 3, Rick is not the Rick of Season 1. He's quieter, he's harder. He makes decisions faster and questions them less. He looks at threats and calculates their resolution rather than debating their ethics. He builds the prison community with military efficiency. He kills people when he has to and explains himself to no one. He becomes, in other words, functionally much closer to what Shane was trying to become, while the narrative continues to frame him as the alternative to Shane. There's a specific moment I want to mention. Season 4, the episode called After, Rick and Carl are alone on the road after the prison falls. Carl has been carrying a building resentment, the feeling that Rick's commitment to the group's ethics, his democracy-adjacent leadership style, cost them the prison, cost people their lives. Carl says something like, if he could do it all again, he'd go with Shane. He says it cruelly, in the way teenagers say the things most likely to wound. And Rick doesn't have a clean answer, because the clean answer isn't available. The show doesn't adjudicate that argument. It sits in the episode like something unresolved, which it is. Carl walks it back somewhat as the episode goes on, and Rick recovers, and father and son find each other again after the immediate crisis passes. But the argument doesn't actually get refuted. Rick doesn't make the case that his way was definitively better. He can't, because the evidence of the immediate situation doesn't support it. What makes Shane's ghost so persistent across the show's full run isn't that he was right and Rick was wrong. It's that the distinction between them was never as clear as the show's moral architecture wanted it to be. Rick needed to believe he was different from Shane, not just better than him, but a different kind of man operating under a different set of principles. And the show needed to believe that too, at least in its first 2 seasons. But the longer it ran, the more it revealed that the difference was one of style more than substance. Rick did terrible things. He did them with more deliberation, more visible ethical cost than Shane would have, but he did them. There's a phrase that comes back across the show at different points, in different contexts. We don't get to be sorry. Its meaning is something like, the regret is real, and it has to stay real, but it doesn't change anything, and it doesn't excuse anything, and you still have to keep going. Shane would have agreed with that completely. He would have stripped out the regret and considered the rest sensible. Rick insists on keeping the regret, on carrying it, on letting it cost him something. Whether that makes Rick right or just more expensively correct is the question the show never answers cleanly. And honestly, I think that's the right call. An answer would be less honest than the unresolved question. There's a thread in The Walking Dead that runs for almost a decade, starting in Season 3, picking up again in Season 9, and not getting fully explained until a spin-off series in 2024. Most viewers probably didn't know it was a thread at all when it started. It looked like a character quirk, a piece of world building, a throwaway detail. It turned out to be the architecture of the show's entire wider mythology. It starts with Jadis. Jadis is introduced in Season 7 as the leader of a community called the Scavengers, who live in a rubbish heap on the outskirts of the main show's geography. They speak in a clipped, stripped-down dialect that sounds like English that's been reduced to its load-bearing words. They're visually striking, strategically unpredictable, and initially impossible to read as friend or foe. Jadis herself is deliberately enigmatic, commanding, cold, with a way of processing things that doesn't quite match any other character's rhythm. She's also, it turns out, something of a middleman. The Scavengers have an arrangement. They've been approached by an organisation, not named at this point, not described in detail, that has made a proposal. If the Scavengers come across survivors, who might be valuable, they hold them and make them available. If they come across threats, same thing. In exchange, the Scavengers get supplies, resources, the kind of material support that makes survival significantly easier. Jadis conducts this arrangement without explaining it. She shows up in Season 8 with a helicopter, an actual working helicopter with functional fuel, which in this world is roughly equivalent to a UFO appearing, and tries to trade Rick to whatever organisation is on the other end of that helicopter. Rick escapes, the helicopter goes, Jadis disappears from the show for a while, and then in Season 9, Rick is blown up on a bridge and presumed dead, except he doesn't die. Jadis is there, the helicopter comes, and Rick is taken. That's all the main show tells you. He's gone. He's alive, presumably. There's a helicopter. The The helicopter has a distinctive symbol on it, 3 interlocking rings. For the viewers watching in 2018, when the episode aired, this was the show blowing up one of its most important relationships in a way that felt both dramatic and deeply unsatisfying. Where was Rick going? Who had the helicopter? Why did Jadis help them? The show offered no answers. It moved forward with a 6-year time jump, repositioned Daryl and Carol as its central figures, and let the helicopter mystery sit unresolved. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. The answers, when they finally came, were worth the wait. But they changed what the show had been about in ways that I think most people haven't fully processed. The organisation with the helicopter is called the CRM, the Civic Republic Military. They protect a hidden city, the Civic Republic, with a population of around 200,000 people, somewhere in Philadelphia. It is the largest surviving community on the continent. It has infrastructure, education, a functioning economy, news broadcasts, art. It is, in terms of what the world in The Walking Dead has to offer, close to extraordinary, and it is utterly ruthless. The CRM classifies people they encounter in the world using a simple system. A or BBs are everyday survivors, people who are trying to get through each day, who will adapt to a new structure, who don't have the specific quality that makes them a problem. Bs get taken in as consignees. They work in the outskirts, contribute labour, and eventually earn citizenship in the city. It's not a gentle system, but it's survivable. As are different. As are leaders, people who will die for what they believe in, people who others follow naturally, who have the quality of conviction that makes them either tremendously valuable or extraordinarily dangerous, depending on which side of them you're on. The CRM's default response to A's is to kill them. The logic being that strong-willed, conviction-driven individuals are the most likely to destabilize any system they're introduced to, and the Civic Republic's security depends on stability above all else. Think about what that means for a moment. The people the CRM considers most dangerous are the same people who, in any other context, would be considered most worth preserving. The leaders. The survivors who kept communities together. The ones who other people trusted, who made decisions under pressure, who built things and protected things, and refused to stop when stopping would have been easier. Those people like Rick, like Michonne, like Carol, like Daryl, are A's, and A's, by CRM policy, are supposed to be eliminated. Jadis understood this system and worked within it and occasionally bent it. The scavenger's arrangement with the CRM gave her access to resources she couldn't get any other way, and she used her position to occasionally protect people she thought were worth protecting, at the cost of the arrangement's formal rules. Rick was an A, obviously, definitively, the most A person in the entire show, and she gave him to the CRM rather than letting the CRM kill him on the spot. That's not nothing. That's Jadis navigating an impossible position, maintaining her arrangement while using whatever discretion she had. The CRM's A/B system is also, when you trace it back, the answer to a question that the show raised in Season 3 and never directly addressed. What happened to people the scavengers collected? The show implied that Jadis and her people were strange and violent and unpredictable. The real answer is more complex and in some ways more disturbing. They were a supply chain, a human supply chain, and they were organised enough to maintain that supply chain for years without anyone in Rick's world knowing it existed. What really unsettles me about all of this, and I mean this in the best possible way, the way you feel unsettled when something is genuinely interesting, is the implication for the main show's history. How many people, across 11 seasons, were quietly classified and quietly removed by an organisation nobody knew was operating? How many communities had encounters with the CRM or its agents without understanding what they were encountering? The 3-ring symbol appears in places across the show that only make sense in retrospect. The helicopter that Rick sees in Atlanta in the very first episode of the very first season, Is that the CRM? If it is, they were there from the beginning, watching, assessing, deciding who qualified as what. The show doesn't confirm this, but it doesn't deny it either. And in a show that planted the French connection in season 1 and paid it off not at all, the possibility that the helicopter in episode 1 was the same organisation that took Rick in season 9 is exactly the kind of thread the show would plant without announcement and then not fully address. What The Ones Who Live eventually gives you, and I think it's genuinely worth mentioning here, is a portrait of what it was like to be Rick inside the CRM. Not just the physical constraint of being unable to leave, the psychological weight of it. He was taken there injured, barely conscious, by a woman he'd had a complicated antagonistic relationship with, and he woke up in a military hospital inside an organisation that had no interest in his consent. He tried to escape 4 times. The 4th attempt cost him his hand, and by the time the spin-off picks him up, he has been there for years, and the man who spent 11 seasons insisting on hope in impossible circumstances has started to lose hope. That particular image, Rick Grimes giving up, is the most quietly devastating thing the Walking Dead universe ever produced. Not his apparent death on the bridge, not any of the losses along the way. Rick sitting in an apartment looking out at a city he's not allowed to leave, having exhausted every escape attempt, is the show looking at its own protagonist and asking, what happens when the hope runs out? What's left when the man who kept going can't keep going anymore? The answer, it turns out, is Michonne finding him, which is both emotionally correct and narratively satisfying and entirely dependent on the specific quality of that relationship. A relationship the main show built across several seasons, and the spin-off pays off. But the question is worth sitting with for a moment before the answer arrives. Because the question is real, and it's honest, and it's the most unguarded the Walking Dead universe ever got about what its premise actually costs the people living inside it. Season 4 does something that the show doesn't always do, which is build a mystery slowly and with real patience. For most of the season, the group is scattered. The prison has fallen. People are separated, on the road, finding each other in pairs or small groups, and running through all of it, threading through the narrative, like a radio signal you can almost hear clearly, is a promise. The signs start appearing along the railroad tracks, hand-painted, weathered, clearly maintained. Sanctuary for all, community for all. Those who arrive, survive. And there's a broadcast, a woman's voice, looping, calm, describing a place called Terminus, a place that will accept anyone who comes. That has room, that has food, that has safety. The show does something interesting with this, which is that it lets you see every separated group encounter these signs independently, and it lets you see the different ways they respond to them. Some want to go immediately, some are skeptical, some are somewhere in between. The calculation each group is making is the same calculation every survivor in that world makes constantly. Is this real? Is this safe? How much does the hope cost if it turns out to be wrong? The answer, when they get there, is catastrophic. Terminus is real. It's staffed by real people who have clearly been there for a while, who have established routines and infrastructure. Mary, the woman who first appears when Rick's group arrives, is cooking over an open fire in what looks like a safe, organised space. She welcomes them warmly. She offers them food. And then Rick starts noticing things. Glenn's riot gear on one of the Terminus residents. Herschel's pocket watch, the one with particular sentimental significance, on another. The poncho that Daryl gave Maggie. Items that should not be in these people's possession. Items that can only be there if something terrible happened to the people who last had them. The welcome unravels in seconds. The gunfire starts, and the group ends up in a boxcar, locked in with the other survivors they've been searching for. What's in the rest of Terminus, the parts the show reveals in the Season 5 premiere, is worse than the boxcar. There are human butchering operations. There are bones and blood, and the systematic processing of people who arrived hoping for sanctuary. Gareth and his community are cannibals, and they have been for a while, and they are frighteningly organised about it. The show could have left Terminus as a simple horror, a bad place with bad people. The Season 5 premiere, called No Sanctuary, could have just been about escaping, and it is mostly about escaping, but it does something else that matters. It gives us a flashback. The flashback shows Gareth and his original community before all of this, locked in that same boxcar. The same one Rick's group was just in. They were survivors who built the Terminus Sanctuary genuinely, who meant the signs, who believed in what they were doing. And then other survivors arrived. And those survivors were violent and organised and without any of the restraint that Gareth's group had been operating under. They took the shelter. They used it. They did things to the people they found there that the show doesn't show in full and doesn't need to. When Gareth's group eventually escaped or were released, the show is deliberate about leaving some of the details unclear. They had a choice about what to do next, and they made the choice that the experience had apparently prepared them to make. They went back. They took their place back, and they decided that the lesson of what had happened to them was the only lesson available. You are either the person who does the taking, or you are the thing that is taken from. There is no third option. You're either the butcher or the cattle. Gareth says this in the boxcar to Rick's group, with the certainty of someone who arrived at a conclusion through painful experience and has never found a reason to revise it. I find Gareth genuinely interesting in a way that the show doesn't quite earn, because his arc is so compressed. He gets a handful of episodes across 2 seasons, and he spends most of them as a villain in the traditional sense, cold, threatening, doing terrible things. But the logic he's operating from isn't irrational, given what he experienced. It's a conclusion that a reasonable person, in sufficiently awful circumstances, might reach. The show doesn't validate it, but it does explain it, which is something. And here's what the Terminus thread leaves behind. Beyond the immediate horror of what happened there, it's a model for what every sanctuary in this show eventually risks becoming. Not through malice necessarily, but through the logic of scarcity and fear. The prison, before Rick's group arrived, had working prisoners inside it who had been surviving there for months. Woodbury, the governor's town, was a functioning community that felt safe to the people who lived in it. Alexandria, when Rick's group arrived, seemed too good to be true to people who had spent years on the road. The kingdom had a literal king in armour with a pet tiger. Every community in this show is the same experiment. Can people maintain something like civilization when civilization has collapsed? Can they keep the rules, the care for strangers, the willingness to share resources, the assumption of good faith, alive in a world that keeps proving those assumptions wrong? The answer the show returns to, again and again, is sort of, for a while, until something breaks it. Terminus started as one of those experiments, and the break came early and badly. And what came out the other side was something that had stopped asking whether the old values were possible and decided they weren't. What keeps this from being purely depressing, I think, is that the show also keeps producing counterexamples. Communities that survive, that maintain something worth having, that don't become Terminus. Not through innocence, they all lose their innocence, but through a combination of luck and choice, and the specific quality of the people involved. The show's argument, made quietly across 11 seasons, is that the difference between Terminus and Alexandria isn't circumstance, it's choice. And choice is the only thing in the story that isn't subject to the apocalypse's otherwise total authority. There's a specific parallel I want to draw out before we leave Terminus, because I think it illuminates something the show understood more clearly in its middle seasons than people give it credit for. The governor, Philip Blake, as he's eventually named, ran Woodbury in a way that looks, from outside, like a stable and reasonable community. There were walls. There were people who felt safe inside them. There were children going to school. The governor organised gladiatorial walker fights in an arena for entertainment, which is a significant strike against the stable and reasonable community reading. But the principle holds. Woodbury worked in a functional sense for the people who were allowed to stay inside it. The governor's particular variety of corruption is different from Gareth's. Gareth's group arrived at their philosophy through victimization. Something was done to them that destroyed their capacity for the assumptions that civilization requires. Philip Blake's corruption is older and more internal. He was a man with a need for control and a willingness to project strength that didn't fully match his internal state. And the apocalypse gave him the conditions under which those qualities could become an entire system of governance. He didn't become a monster because the world broke him. He was already a specific kind of person, and the world gave that person unlimited authority. Both of them, Gareth and the governor, are managing the same fundamental anxiety that every community leader in this show manages. The anxiety that the walls won't hold, that the resources will run out, that the group is one bad day from dissolution. The difference is what they're willing to do to quiet that anxiety, and what they tell themselves about the people outside the walls who might, theoretically, threaten what's inside. Gareth decided the people outside were meat. The governor decided the people outside were threats to be neutralized. Rick decided the people outside were potential allies, potential family, potential community, until proved otherwise. The show's long argument is that Rick was right, but it never quite pretends the argument was easy. Carol Pelletier is easy to miss in Season 1. She's designed to be easy to miss. She's in the background of almost every group shot, quiet, careful, taking up as little space as possible. When she speaks, it's usually to agree with someone else or to defer. Her defining characteristic in the first season is absence of self. She's there, technically, but she's made herself nearly invisible. This is not accidental. Carol has spent years making herself invisible to her husband, Ed, who is the kind of man who uses other people's smallness to make himself feel larger. The show doesn't dwell on this. It doesn't need to. A few scenes with Ed are sufficient. The way Carol's shoulders shift when he speaks. The speed with which she agrees with things. The moment when he tells her daughter Sophia to stay with him, rather than join the group for a meal. And Carol's expression does something complicated and then settles into compliance. You understand what the situation has been. Ed dies early in the series, during the Walker attack on the camp at the end of Season 1. He's being mauled and Carol finishes the job herself, with a pickaxe, with considerably more force than the situation strictly requires. The show frames this as practical. She needs to prevent reanimation. And it is. It's also something else, and the show knows it, and it moves on without comment. What Carol is, it turns out, is someone who has been suppressing a very specific set of qualities for a very long time, and whose qualities in this new world turn out to be essential. She is patient, she is observant, she is completely without self-deception. She understands what a situation requires, and she is capable of doing what a situation requires without flinching, and she's not particularly interested in being thanked for it. The first real sign of what Carol is capable of comes at the prison in Season 4. Two people in the cell block, Karen and David, are showing signs of the flu that's been spreading through the community. The risk is a full outbreak inside a confined space where most of the population has no immune history and no medical infrastructure worth speaking of. Carol makes a unilateral decision. She takes them out, quietly, without anyone's knowledge, without asking for permission or discussing the ethics or putting it to a vote. She burns the bodies, she returns to her duties, she doesn't tell anyone. Rick finds out. He exiles her for it. The community goes on without her. The flu outbreak still happens and kills several people, though not as many as it might have. And the question the show raises and then declines to properly answer is whether Carol was right. Not morally right in some absolute sense, the show isn't interested in that framing, but operationally right. Given what she knew, given what she could see coming, given the information available to her at the time, was the action, she took the action that produced the best outcome. It's not obviously no. The show presents it as obviously wrong, because Rick exiles her for it, and the audience is positioned to feel the weight of the exile. But the show also shows us the outbreak continuing after Carol is gone. People dying from it anyway, and the community surviving it, barely, in ways that raise the uncomfortable possibility that Carol's calculation, even if the implementation was wrong, wasn't wrong. She comes back, of course. She comes back in the same episode that takes down the prison. And from that point forward, her role in the show's story shifts in ways that aren't announced but are unmistakable. The Alexandria arc is where this becomes explicit. When the group arrives at Alexandria, a walled community that has been functioning under relative safety for some time, Carol assesses the situation and makes a strategic decision. She presents herself as a harmless, slightly confused suburban housewife. She wears cardigans, she brings casseroles to the neighbours, she learns names, asks gentle questions, keeps her head down, and behind that presentation, she is gathering information, identifying threats, making maps of the community's assets and vulnerabilities, and planning for what she already suspects is coming. There's a scene in Alexandria where Carol is speaking with one of the children of the community, Sam, a boy who's been coming to her to bake cookies and process his anxiety. And he pushes her on something, and she tells him something like this, that if he tells anyone what he's seen, she will take him into the dark and leave him tied to a tree for the monsters to find, and he'll never see his mum again. She says this to a child in a kitchen, while the biscuits are in the oven. Her face doesn't change. Her voice is completely level. It's one of the most genuinely chilling moments in the show's run. Not because Carol is being cruel, she's protecting the group in her estimation, but because the distance between the woman making the biscuits and the woman making the threat is zero. They are exactly the same person. She doesn't step in and out of a persona. The persona is Carol and Carol is the persona. The only thing that changes is what the situation requires. What the show eventually arrives at in its later seasons is the question of what Carol costs to be Carol. The answer, it turns out, is quite a lot. She carries the weight of what she's done and keeps doing in ways that occasionally crack the surface. Her relationship with Daryl, which I'll come back to in a moment, is the primary site of that weight, the place where she's allowed to be unguarded in ways she isn't anywhere else. The look at the flowers moment, which comes in season 4 during the group's time on the road after the prison falls, is probably the most discussed thing Carol does in the entire series. Lizzie, one of the children Carol has been caring for, has killed her sister Mika because Lizzie believed, sincerely, not maliciously, that the Walkers were simply a different kind of person, and that if Mika came back, she'd understand. She wants to let Carol and Tyrese come back to find proof. She's holding a knife. She is absolutely not safe. Carol sends Tyrese away. She tells Lizzie to look at the flowers, and she does what has to be done. And then she sits down in the grass and cries for a while, and then she gets up and keeps going. The show doesn't editorially comment on this. It presents it as the most painful thing Carol has ever had to do, and it trusts the audience to understand why she did it, without the show telling them whether she was right to do it. That's a level of confidence in the material that not many shows have at that point in their run, and it works because Carol has been established well enough that the weight of the scene lands without mechanical explanation. Her relationship with Daryl is the emotional core of the show's later seasons in a way that doesn't get enough acknowledgement. They are not a romantic relationship. The show is careful about this, though whether out of intent or indecision is its own question. What they are is something rarer and more interesting. Two people who understand each other's damage completely, who are both diminished by their pasts in specific and complementary ways, who found in each other the only person they don't have to perform for. When they talk, which isn't that often, they say very little. They don't need to say much. The show trusts that the audience has done the work of understanding both characters well enough that a conversation between them communicates more than its literal content. That's what Carol is, ultimately, in the show's full arc. Not a monster, not a hero. A person whose capabilities became apparent in a world that required them, who has to live with everything those capabilities have cost, and who keeps going anyway. She might be the show's most honest portrait of what survival actually looks like from the inside. And I think it's worth spending a moment on what happens to Carol in the show's later seasons, because the writers do something quietly interesting with her that I don't think gets enough credit. After the war, with the Saviors, after Alexandria is established as a sustainable community with genuine roots, Carol has a period that looks, from the outside, like something approaching peace. She and Ezekiel, the kingdom's theatrical, tiger-owning, genuinely warm-hearted king, have a relationship. She becomes something like a mother to Henry, his ward. She has a house. She has people. And the show uses this period not to reward her exactly, but to establish what she has to lose. Because the Whisperers, when they come, take Henry. He ends up on the pike, and the Carol of season 10, in the aftermath of that, is a different version of the woman we've been watching. Not worse, not broken quite, but altered in a specific way. The losses have accumulated to a point where her usual mechanisms for managing them, the compartmentalization, the forward momentum, the refusal to dwell, aren't fully working anymore. There's a long stretch of season 10 where Carol is operating while clearly compromised. She makes decisions that create problems for the people around her. She takes risks that go further than operational necessity. And the show, to its credit, doesn't frame this as Carol being wrong about the Whisperers or about Alpha. It frames it as Carol being right, but at a cost to herself that she's not fully accounting for. The distinction matters. She's not failing. She's paying a price, and the price is real. Her arc through those seasons resolves not with a clean catharsis, but with something more modest and more durable, a reassessment, a renegotiation with herself about what she can carry and what she can't. It's one of the quieter character developments in the show's run, and it's easy to miss inside all the action. But it's there, and it makes Carol, by the final seasons, not just the show's most dangerous figure, but its most complete one. Someone who has integrated rather than avoided what the world has made of her. I want to try something with this section, which is to think about Negan not primarily as a villain, which he is clearly, by any reasonable standard, but as an administrator. Because what Negan actually built, which doesn't get examined nearly enough, is something more sophisticated than a gang, and taking it seriously as a system tells you something interesting about what the show is arguing about power. Negan shows up at the end of season 6 with a barbed wire baseball bat called Lucille and proceeds to kill 2 members of Rick's group in front of the others as a demonstration of what non-compliance looks like. This is, for the record, an absolutely clear moral atrocity, and nothing I'm about to say is intended to suggest otherwise. But it's worth asking why a man capable of organising the level of violence on display in that scene chose to use it primarily as a demonstration rather than as a systematic policy. The Saviors, at the point when Rick's group encounters them, are a substantial operation. They control multiple outposts. They have hundreds of members, possibly more. They manage tribute arrangements with at least 3 separate communities: the Hilltop, the Kingdom, and Alexandria. Each of those communities produces different resources. Hilltop produces agricultural goods, the Kingdom produces food and materials, Alexandria produces labour and scavenged goods. The tribute flows into the sanctuary, the Saviour's main base, and then gets redistributed. It's not random theft, it's a structured economy. The internal structure of the sanctuary is equally organised. There are points, an actual points-based currency system. People earn points through work and spend them on goods and services. There are rules about violence between members, and those rules are enforced, sometimes harshly. The famous iron, Negan's punishment for transgression is being burned on the face with a hot iron, is brutal, but it is rule-based brutality. There's a process. There's an offence and a consequence that's consistent and publicly known. The wives are a different and genuinely indefensible aspect of the Saviour's structure, and I'm not going to try to contextualise them into something they're not. Negan's harem is coercive, full stop, and the show doesn't pretend otherwise. But even here, there are formal rules. The wives have protections that other sanctuary members don't, and Negan treats violation of those protections as a serious offence. This is a man who has built rules, whose rules have internal logic, who enforces those rules consistently. That the rules themselves are monstrous is the point, but the structure isn't the chaos it looks like from outside. Here's the question that the show raises and doesn't quite answer. Compared to the chaos that Alexandria, the hilltop, and the kingdom were managing before Negan arrived, the walker herds, the rival groups, the resource uncertainty, the absence of any external trade, was the Savior's tribute system actually worse for the people living under it? I know how that sounds. The answer is obviously yes, partly because the tribute system extracted resources under threat of lethal violence, which is not a voluntary economic arrangement by any definition. But if you set aside the coercion and ask purely about outcomes, about whether communities had more stable access to resources, more organised security, more predictability about what the next season would look like, the Saviour's arrangement isn't obviously inferior to what existed before. The kingdom was functional and had its own structure. The hilltop was struggling under Gregory's incompetent leadership. Alexandria was doing reasonably well, but had survived entirely by luck for a significant stretch of its history. The show's actual counter-argument to Negan isn't that his system doesn't work. It's that fear produces compliance, not the thing that makes communities actually cohere. And the events of Season 8 bear that out. The Saviour's structure collapsed the moment the fear was removed, because fear was the only load-bearing wall. What happens to Negan after his defeat is one of the more interesting narrative choices the show makes in its second half. Rick spares him, a decision that is almost universally controversial in universe, and Negan spends several seasons in a cell in Alexandria, living under the community's care and its distrust in roughly equal measure. He's allowed some privileges. He gardens, he talks to people, particularly Judith, with a degree of honesty he didn't offer most of his saviors. He reflects, apparently genuinely, on what he built and why. The Jeffrey Dean Morgan arc across the show's later seasons turns Negan from a villain into something more complicated. A man who understood power and used it completely wrongly, who knows this, who is trying to understand what a different application of those same capabilities might look like, and who keeps getting tested by a world that doesn't particularly want him to succeed. His relationship with Maggie, who has every reason to want him dead, whose husband he murdered, who cannot look at him without seeing Glenn's death, is the show's most carefully constructed moral territory. Not redemption. The show is smart enough to know that word doesn't apply here. Something else. Something more like mutual recognition of a shared world in which they are both still operating. There's a line Negan says, toward the end of the series, that stays with me. He tells someone, and I'm paraphrasing from memory here, that he finally understood what he'd taken from Glenn and Maggie and Herschel when he was standing in a lineup himself, facing the possibility of losing everything in the way they had. That understanding came too late to be useful to anyone it hurt, but it came. The question nobody in the show asks directly, but that the events of the show imply, is something like this. If Negan had applied his organizational instincts and his capacity for leadership to something like the communities Rick was building, if the qualities he used to build the saviors had been pointed in a different direction, what might he have built? The show gestures toward an answer in its final seasons but doesn't commit, which might be the right call. Some questions are more interesting open than closed. There's also the question of who Negan was before, which the show gestures at and then mostly leaves alone. We get fragments. He had a wife named Lucille, who became the name of the Bat, a detail that the show treats as emotionally significant without fully unwrapping what it means. He was a coach, apparently. A man used to working with young people, used to the particular kind of authority that comes from developing someone's potential rather than simply commanding them. Whether that background is ironic given what he became, or whether it actually explains something about the structure of the saviors, the hierarchy, the mentorship elements within it, the way Negan positions himself as someone who could make you better if you just did what he said, is left to the viewer to work out. What I keep coming back to with Negan is that his ideology, stripped of the violence, is actually a coherent theory of what people need. His people are a resource line, which gets quoted in context as menacing, and it is also, if you follow it through, a statement that people matter. Not sentimentally, not because of any inherent dignity, but because they are the only thing that has value in this world, the only productive unit, the only source of anything worth having. You can't eat ideology. You can't eat moral rectitude. You can eat what a functioning, organised community of people can produce. In a world stripped of everything else, people are the resource. That observation is not wrong. Everything Negan built on top of it was. And there's one more thing about the Saviours that deserves a mention before we move on, which is the two lieutenants, who most clearly reveal the fault lines in the organisation's ideology. Simon and Dwight. They're both senior saviours, they're both capable in their own ways, and they represent the two directions a subordinate can go in a system built entirely on one person's force of will. Simon is the true believer in violence. He's the one who, during the war, with Alexandria's coalition, starts moving toward extermination rather than control, killing populations rather than subjugating them. Negan has to rein him back, which is an interesting moment, because it reveals that even Negan, who built this system on the demonstration of overwhelming force, has a line. He doesn't want to deplete the resource, he wants to use it. Simon can't or won't maintain that distinction. He's taken the ideology and run it somewhere Negan didn't intend. That's what happens inside coercive systems, when the coercion is the point rather than the means. The most enthusiastic enforcers eventually outrun the philosophy. Dwight goes the other direction. He defects. He's been living inside the Saviour's structure because he had no alternative, and he's been looking for one the whole time. His particular story, the iron on his face, the wife he lost to Negan's harem arrangement, the years of compliance and the sustained private refusal, is the show's most complete portrait of what it costs to survive inside a system you know is wrong without being able to resist it yet. And when he finally does resist, the show handles his redemption arc with more care than it handles some of its other turnarounds. Dwight earns his defection. The audience understands what it cost him and what it means. Simon and Dwight together answer the question of what the Saviours would have become without Negan. Not a functional community, not even a stable authoritarian state. The ideology depended entirely on him specifically. Take him out, and you either get Simon accelerating into pure elimination, or Dwight defecting towards something better. There was no middle. There was only Negan holding the contradiction together. There's a version of The Walking Dead where Morgan Jones is the show's central figure. He's the first person Rick encounters after waking up, in the first episode of the whole series. He's the one who explains the world. He's the one who keeps Rick alive long enough for Rick to understand what's happened. He is, in that sense, the door through which the viewer enters the story, and then he disappears for 2.5 seasons. When Morgan comes back in season 3, the show does something genuinely startling. He is unrecognisable, not in appearance particularly, though he's thinner and harder, unrecognisable in kind. The gentle, careful, grief-stricken man who helped Rick, who was clearly still trying to hold on to something, that Morgan is gone. In his place is someone who has covered the walls of a building with traps and warning signs and philosophical statements in paint. Clear is the word he returns to over and over. Clear everything. Kill everything. There is no third option. What happened between those two appearances is the story the show tells in fragments, and eventually, more fully in one of its finest hours, the season 6 episode called Here's Not Here. Morgan, after Rick left him at the beginning, continued trying to survive in the town where his wife and son had lived. His son, Dwayne, eventually became a walker, and Morgan couldn't do it. Couldn't kill the thing that had been his son. And Dwayne, as a walker, killed him. He killed Morgan's wife, the woman who had already been a walker. the one Morgan had been unable to bring himself to put down since the very beginning. So Morgan lost his son because he couldn't kill his wife, and then he had to kill his son anyway. That sequence of events is within the logic of the world the show has built about the worst thing that could happen to someone. Not because of the deaths, death is everywhere in this world, but because of the specific causal chain. Morgan's mercy, his inability to act, was the direct cause of what he lost. The lesson this teaches, if you're someone without external support or perspective, is that mercy is lethal. That the soft instinct, the human instinct, costs you the most human things you have. That you have to clear everything because anything you don't clear will come back and take what you love. And Morgan alone, with nowhere to go and no one to think through this with, arrives at that lesson and builds his entire subsequent existence on it. He sets traps. He kills everything he encounters. He writes his philosophy on the walls because the walls are the only audience he has. What pulls him out of this, what begins to, is a man named Eastman and a goat named Tabitha. Eastman is a former forensic psychiatrist who has been living alone in a cabin in the woods and has somehow maintained not just his sanity, but his ethics. He is committed as a matter of principle to a philosophy he calls, all life is precious. He practices the Japanese martial art of Aikido, which is defensive rather than offensive. Its entire framework is redirecting the opponent's force rather than striking. He is, given his circumstances, almost offensively well-adjusted. He captures Morgan, who has attacked him. He keeps him in a cell. He feeds him. He talks to him. He is patient in a way that has no practical justification, because Morgan is violent and unstable, and there's no obvious upside to investing in him. Eastman does it anyway, because Eastman genuinely believes that all life is precious, and Morgan's life is included in that. However difficult Morgan is making that position to defend in practice, what happens over the course of their time together is Morgan coming back. Not all the way, not immediately, not without cost, but back towards something. The episode documents this with extraordinary care. It's a small story. 2 people, a cabin, a goat, the slow work of rebuilding a person from near nothing, and it's one of the most complete pieces of television the show ever produced. The philosophy Morgan takes from Eastman is sincere. It's not a strategy. It's not a pose. He genuinely commits to all life is precious in a way that carries the full weight of where he's been. You understand that he's not adopting a comfortable position. He's adopting the most difficult position available to him, precisely because of what he's already done and because of what he needs to believe in order to keep going. And then the show tests that philosophy, relentlessly. Over multiple seasons, Morgan's commitment to not killing creates problems, practical, strategic, moral problems that the show doesn't resolve in anyone's favour. There are moments where his restraint gets people hurt. There are moments where it creates space for others to act, and where that matters. The show is genuinely undecided about him, which is one of the things that makes him interesting. What breaks it, eventually, is the sustained weight of everything the world keeps doing. Rick's community, the Saviour's War, Henry's death. People keep dying around Morgan, and his philosophy keeps being tested. And at a certain point, the philosophy becomes insufficient, not wrong, but insufficient for what he's being asked to survive. He leaves Rick's community. He goes to the Fear the Walking Dead universe, which is running in parallel, and he takes his philosophy with him and keeps trying to hold on to it and keeps having it challenged in new ways. Morgan's arc across both shows is a portrait of what happens when a good principle meets a world that has no particular interest in rewarding good principles. The principle survives, but it keeps taking damage. The man survives, but he keeps taking damage. And the question the show is implicitly asking, without answering, is a philosophy that survives this world still the same philosophy? Does the version of all life is precious that Morgan holds on to after everything he's experienced actually still resemble what Eastman taught him? Or has it been deformed, quietly, by everything it had to survive? I don't know. The show doesn't say. Morgan keeps going, which is the show's version of an answer, and maybe that's the only answer that's actually available. Let me spend a bit more time on Eastman, because I think he's one of the show's most undervalued characters, and because what he represents is the clearest statement the show ever makes about what it believes. Eastman is presented as someone who chose, deliberately and at significant cost, to be a good person in a world that punishes good people. He's not naive, or he's a forensic psychiatrist, a man who spent his career understanding what human beings are capable of at their worst. He knows exactly how bad things can get. He knew before the apocalypse, and he knows now. And he's still committed to all life is precious. Not because the evidence supported it as a survival strategy, it doesn't cleanly, but because it was who he wanted to be, and he had decided that who he wanted to be was non-negotiable. There's a detail in Here's Not Here that I think about more than probably makes sense. Eastman has a goat. Her name is Tabitha. He keeps her alive, takes care of her, lets her give milk, lets her eat the grass around the cabin. In practical terms, the goat is a food source. But Eastman doesn't treat her as a food source. He treats her as a companion. He names her. He talks to her. He is, in the middle of an apocalypse, maintaining a relationship with an animal that has no tactical justification. Morgan, when he arrives, is confused by this. The goat represents everything his clear philosophy considers waste: resources and attention, and emotional investment in something that doesn't increase your survival odds. But Eastman's point, demonstrated rather than argued, is that the goat is exactly the point. That keeping something alive and caring for it and naming it is not a failure of resource management. It's a practice. It's how you keep being the kind of person who can care about things. If you stop practicing it, you stop being able to do it. Morgan learns this, he takes it with him, and the fact that he keeps learning it and losing it and finding it again across 2 shows is not evidence that Eastman was wrong. It's evidence that the practice requires constant renewal, that it's not a revelation you have once. It's a daily decision to remain capable of it. That distinction between something you learn and something you keep having to choose is the Morgan thread in miniature. And it's, if you follow it through, the show's most honest statement about what being a good person actually requires. Not a moment of insight, not a conversion, just the decision made again and again in circumstances that keep making it harder. Imagine being out on the road, months or years into the apocalypse, and seeing a herd of walkers approaching. This has happened hundreds of times. You know the protocol. You get out of the way, you go silent, you let them pass. And then one of the walkers, in the middle of the herd, turns its head and looks directly at you. Not with the unfocused, stimulus-driven attention of a reanimated dead person. With intent, with recognition. That's the Whisperers. The reveal of the Whisperers, in the second half of Season 8 and into Season 9, is the show at its most genuinely creepy. Not action horror creepy, not jump scare creepy, but concept creepy. The kind that sits with you because the idea itself is disturbing, not just its execution. The Whisperers are humans who wear walker skin masks and move among the dead. They've learned to walk like walkers, to smell like walkers, to make the low sounds that walkers make. They move with herds, guide them, use them as weapons and walls and infrastructure. They are, by the time the story meets them, one of the most sophisticated survival strategies the show has ever presented. And the strategy is built on a philosophy, a coherent, internally consistent, deeply troubling philosophy. Alpha, the Whisperers' leader, believes that civilization was the mistake. Not this civilization, not some specific cultural arrangement that went wrong. Civilization as such. The idea that humans are separate from and superior to the natural world. The idea that we get to build walls and pretend the outside isn't coming for us. The idea that we are not animals. The Whisperers, in Alpha's view, have simply accepted the truth that everyone else is still refusing to see. The dead are honest, the natural world doesn't care about human dignity, and the only survival strategy that works in the long run is submission. become part of what you can't fight. Don't fight the herd. Be the herd. The masks are the symbol of this. Wearing a dead person's face is not, in Alpha's world, disrespectful or horrifying. It's practical, it's honest, it's the acknowledgement that the difference between the human wearing the mask and the walker, whose face is now the mask, is one of degree, not of kind. We're all organic matter, we're all temporary. The walkers are simply further along. Lydia, Alpha's daughter, is the show's window into what it's actually like to grow up inside this philosophy, and it's not survivable in any recognisable sense. Childhood in the Whisperers is whatever you make it when you strip away everything that childhood is supposed to be for. Connection, safety, development, the assumption that the adults around you are trying to build something for you to inherit. Alpha's childhood for Lydia had none of that. It had a philosophy, and it had the imperative to survive, and it had the consistent message that attachment is weakness, and weakness is death. Beta's backstory is one of the show's most interesting reveals, delivered quietly and then not elaborated on. Beta, the Whisperer's enforcer, a massive and nearly silent man who moves through the world with a terrible efficiency, was, before the apocalypse, a country music star. He was recognisable enough that a promotional poster at a hotel reveals his former identity, and he has obliterated that identity so thoroughly, has so committed to the Whisperer philosophy of self-erasure, that the revelation feels almost violent. The man on the poster and the man with the skin mask over his face are occupying the same body, but have essentially nothing else in common. What does it take to erase yourself that completely? To take someone who was, at some point, a public figure, someone who made music for an audience, who had a persona attached to his name, who existed in relation to other people in ways that required him to be recognised, and make him into Beta? The show doesn't dwell on the process, but the end result is one of its most complete portraits of what the worst version of the Whisperer philosophy produces. A person who has successfully become nothing, and who serves the nothing with total commitment. The Pike scene is the moment the Whisperers announce themselves to the wider world in terms no one can miss. Alpha builds a border, a literal boundary line marked with poles, and on those poles she places the heads of people she's taken from the communities she considers a threat. 10 people, including Henry, Carol's adopted son. The scene is horrifying not just because of what it is, but because of what it communicates. This is a message. This is a boundary in the most literal possible sense. Alpha is saying, here is where your world ends. Everything beyond this line is ours, and the cost of crossing it is this. The argument Alpha is making is the same argument the show has been having with itself since Shane. That the soft instinct costs you the most. That the communities with their walls and their rules and their names and their care for each other are building beautiful things that the world will eventually destroy. She's not wrong that the world will eventually destroy them. She's wrong about what the right response to that fact is. And here's what I find genuinely interesting about the Whisperers as a faction when I'm thinking about them late at night. Their philosophy is not internally incoherent. It is wrong. The show is clear that it's wrong, and I think the show is right. But it's not arbitrary. It's a response to real conditions, taken seriously, applied consistently, and lived by people who have paid real costs to maintain it. Alpha's commitment to the Whisperer philosophy cost her daughter, ultimately. Lydia left, and Alpha chose the philosophy over the daughter because Alpha is perhaps the show's most complete portrait of what it looks like when an idea takes over a person so completely that nothing else survives. Beta's death is the scene I keep coming back to. He dies in the final battle with the Whisperers, stabbed in the eyes by Daryl, swarmed by walkers. As the walkers close in, as his mask is pulled away, Beta dies with a smile. And the show leaves it there. It doesn't explain the smile. It doesn't give you Beta's internal state or his final understanding of things. It just shows you a man dying surrounded by the dead, with his face uncovered for the first time, and smiling. Is that horror? Is that peace? Is that the whisperer philosophy finally completing its logic? A man who chose to be among the dead, finally becoming one of them, and finding in that completion something that functions like relief. I don't know. The show doesn't know either, or doesn't want to say. It's one of those moments where the ambiguity is the point, where locking down the interpretation would diminish it. What the whisperers leave behind is a question. What are the communities actually for? And the show has already answered that, through Shane and Negan and everyone in between. The communities are for the people inside them. Not because they're permanent, just because they are. That's not a powerful argument against a committed nihilist. Alpha would dismiss it, but it's the truest answer the show has, and it earns it by the time it arrives at it. There's a thread within the Whisperer arc that I want to come back to before we move on, which is Lydia. Because Lydia is doing something specific in the story that isn't always fully acknowledged. She's the refutation argument. She's the person who grew up entirely inside the Whisperer philosophy, who had no other framework, no prior experience of what community or care or connection was supposed to look like, and who left anyway. Not because of a better argument, not because someone proved the Whisperer philosophy wrong through debate, because Henry was kind to her specifically, because one person treated her with a consideration that the Whisperer world had told her was weakness, and it turned out to be the most disruptive thing she'd ever encountered. There's something important in that. The show, over its full run, keeps coming back to the idea that what changes people is not argument but contact. Not the better idea, but the better experience. Morgan didn't reason his way out of Clear. He encountered Eastman, and Eastman was kind, and the kindness was incomprehensible to him, and then comprehensible, and then transformative. Lydia didn't reason her way out of the Whisperers. She met people who demonstrated, by living it rather than arguing it, that a different set of assumptions was possible. Alpha understood this, which is why she worked so hard to keep Lydia isolated. Not because the communities were militarily threatening to the Whisperers, they weren't, not initially, but because contact was contagious. Because if Lydia experienced what genuine community felt like, the Whisperer philosophy would not survive the comparison. Alpha was right about that. She was just wrong about the conclusion. The solution wasn't to prevent the contact. The solution, the actual livable solution, was to not build a philosophy that couldn't survive contact with something better. Eugene Porter arrives in the show in season 4, in the aftermath of the prison's fall, with a mullet that deserves its own character credit, and an introduction that is one of the show's most memorable pieces of misdirection. He's travelling with Abraham Ford, a former soldier with more physical presence than most people would know what to do with, and Rosita Espinosa, who is sharply competent and immediately suspicious of most things. Abraham has clearly organised his life, his energy, and his protective instincts entirely around Eugene. Eugene is the mission. Eugene is the reason Abraham gets up in the morning, and that reason is stated baldly and early. Eugene knows what caused the outbreak, has contacts in Washington, D.C. who can use that information, and getting him there is the most important thing anyone in this world can do. Eugene himself confirms this in the particular verbal manner he develops, formal, elaborate, prone to using 3 words where one would do, and you have no particular reason to disbelieve him, because why would someone lie about this? What would be the point of inventing an expertise you don't have? The answer to that question is that Eugene Porter is a coward who understood that in a world built on physical survival, his body was not going to protect him. He is not a fighter. He is not fast. He has no particular practical skills in the categories that matter most in the immediate aftermath of the apocalypse. What he has is intelligence, and the specific intelligence most useful to him in his particular crisis. He is very good at making things up and making them sound plausible, and he identified correctly that there was one thing he could claim to know that would attach a capable protector to him indefinitely. He didn't know what caused the outbreak. He doesn't know. He has hypotheses, some of which are interesting and none of which are actionable. The contacts in Washington don't exist in any meaningful sense. The mission is a fiction he constructed to survive, and it worked. And he is living inside it with full awareness that the fiction is a fiction, and with the sustained anxiety of a man who knows that discovery will be catastrophic. Abraham has sacrificed a great deal for this mission. 2 previous groups, people who followed him because of the mission, are gone. The weight Abraham carries when he finally understands what it was all for is immense. The show handles his discovery of the truth with a physical immediacy that's very characteristic of the show's best moments. Abraham punches Eugene hard enough to knock him unconscious, and then sits down in the road and doesn't say anything, because there isn't anything to say. Eugene's confession is delivered, as most of his most important statements are, in a context that strips away all the verbal elaboration he usually hides behind. He just says it. He was scared, he needed help, he made it up. The apology delivered in his particular register is one of the most tonally strange scenes in the show's run. A man whose verbal dexterity has been his primary survival tool, stripped of the use of it. And then the show does something interesting, which is that it doesn't discard Eugene. It doesn't let him be simply a liar who gets punished and moves on. It keeps him around, keeps developing him, and slowly builds toward one of the most satisfying character reversals in the series. Eugene is interested in chemistry. He says so early. It's one of the few things he says that's unambiguously true. He has knowledge. He's studied things. He's spent his life inside his own head, and inside his head there are genuinely useful things if the situation ever requires them. At Alexandria, he makes bullets. The community is running low on ammunition, which, in a world sustained by firearms, is an existential problem. And Eugene proposes that he can produce more. He can. He knows how. He sets up a manufacturing process. It works. It's unglamorous, it's time-consuming, it doesn't make good television, and the show mostly doesn't dwell on it. But it matters. The bullets that Alexandria's fighters use in the war against the Saviors include bullets Eugene made. Later still, at the Commonwealth, the large structured community that occupies the show's final seasons, Eugene's chemistry background becomes something more significant. He works quietly on something that the show takes a while to reveal. What he's developed is a method of contaminating walker blood with a pathogen, a compound derived from walkers themselves, that is lethal to humans on contact. Delivered into a herd, it creates a biological weapon that the community's defenders can use against the walkers in ways that conventional weapons can't match. And it is this piece of chemistry, developed by this man who lied about being a scientist, that turns the tide of the final battle of the main series. The herd that threatens to overwhelm the Commonwealth is neutralized, in significant part because of something Eugene figured out and built. The lie was that he knew what caused the outbreak. The truth was that he was exactly the kind of person who, given time and resources and a reason to apply himself, might be able to do something about the outbreak's consequences. The lie said he had knowledge he didn't have. The truth was that he had capability he hadn't yet developed. The gap between the two was filled, across several seasons, by everything that happened to him. Everything he experienced, lost, found, built. I don't think the show planned this from the beginning. I think Eugene started as a specific type of character and developed into something more interesting as the writers spent more time with him. But the result, whether planned or organic, is one of those character arcs that retroactively improves everything that came before it. The man who lied about being the world's most important scientist turns out to be, in a different way than he claimed, the world's most important scientist. Not because he had the answer, but because he was the one who eventually found it. There's a dimension of Eugene's story that doesn't get enough attention, which is the radio. While at Alexandria, Eugene acquires a ham radio and begins transmitting into nothing, talking into dead air as a kind of practice at presence, a habit of pretending to connect with people before he actually has to do it for real. It's a very Eugene solution to loneliness. Don't try to connect with the people who are physically near you, with whom connection requires the most vulnerable kind of effort. Send signals into the void. See if anything comes back. What comes back is Stephanie, a voice on the other end of the radio, from a community Eugene can't locate or verify, who likes talking to him. Their conversations are tentative at first, and then less so, and Eugene, the man who fabricated an entire scientific expertise to avoid being left alone, starts telling the truth to a stranger on a radio. Not because he's reformed exactly, but because the stakes feel lower at the distance a radio provides. He can be honest when he can't be seen. And then the show, to its credit, eventually closes the distance. Stephanie becomes real, the Commonwealth becomes real, and Eugene has to hold on to honesty in person, which is the harder version of the same thing, and mostly manages it. What I find touching about that arc in a very understated way is that Eugene's path to genuine connection ran through the same tool as his path to self-deception. He used words to construct the lie that kept him alive. He used words later to build the first real relationship he'd had in years. The medium was the same, the direction was different, and the difference, the show suggests quietly, is everything. There's one more dimension of Eugene's arc that I want to mention before we move on, which is what happens between him and Abraham after the confession. Abraham is furious. Obviously, he has lost two groups of people, organised his entire post-apocalyptic identity around a mission that didn't exist, and the person responsible for that is sitting in the road, apologising in unnecessarily formal language. The fury makes complete sense, but Abraham doesn't abandon Eugene. He stays. He processes it. In the way Abraham processes things, loudly, physically, at considerable cost to nearby furniture. And then he stays. And the relationship that develops between them afterward is one of the show's quieter pleasures. Abraham understanding that Eugene is not actually useless. Eugene understanding that Abraham is not actually defined by the mission. Two people who are bound together by a lie, discovering that the thing the lie was built on, mutual usefulness, mutual need, was actually there underneath it the whole time. What the lie cost Abraham is harder to account for. The two groups who followed him on the mission are gone. People made decisions based on false information that Eugene provided. Those decisions had consequences. Abraham carries that, in addition to everything else he carries, and the show doesn't let him put it down. But it also doesn't let his grief about it consume everything else. He keeps going. He finds things worth going for. He's happy, in his particular blunt way, in the time between the confession and his death, which is either the show suggesting that people are more resilient than their worst moments, or the show refusing to let the weight of history pin anyone permanently in place. Probably both. Before we start winding down, I want to spend some time on the smaller things. Not the major mysteries, not the central philosophical arguments, those we've talked about, but the loose threads, the things the show introduced, left hanging, and then either quietly forgot about or deliberately preserved in a state of unresolution. I find these genuinely compelling, in the way that you find the corner of a painting compelling more than the centre. Something about the edges of a story telling you things the middle is too busy to say. The helicopter in episode 1 of season 1 is the one I keep coming back to. Rick has just arrived in Atlanta on horseback. He's looking for survivors, looking for something, in the chaos of a city that has been overrun and largely abandoned. And as he rides through the empty streets, he sees a helicopter, an actual working helicopter, with fuel functional, flying overhead. He tries to follow it. He can't. The walkers find him first. We now know from what the ones who live revealed about the CRM that the Civic Republic military had helicopters and was using them to identify and collect certain survivors from relatively early in the outbreak. Jadis tells Rick that the scavengers had been working with the CRM for some time before his arrival at their camp. The three-ring symbol appears, if you're looking for it, in places across the earlier seasons. Was the helicopter in episode 1 a CRM helicopter? The show doesn't say. If it was, then the organisation that eventually took Rick had eyes on his city, potentially on Rick himself, right from the beginning of the story. They were there before he found Laurie, before he found the group, before any of the events that defined his decade of survival. They were already circling, and either they assessed him and decided he wasn't worth collecting at that point, or they saw him and filed him away, or they missed him, or it was a different helicopter entirely. I don't know what the show intends, but the possibility that it was the CRM, that the first thing Rick saw in the ruined world was the organisation that would eventually swallow 6 years of his life, is the kind of circular storytelling that, if intentional, would be genuinely beautiful. The variant walkers are a thread from the show's later seasons that feels more like an abandoned storyline than a deliberate mystery. In season 11, the characters start encountering walkers that behave differently, opening doors, using rocks, exhibiting a level of coordinated behaviour that the standard walker biology shouldn't allow for. Aaron at one point tears the face off what he thinks is a whisperer, only to find it's a walker underneath. A walker that was doing what whisperers do, without any human inside to instruct it. "How the hell did a walker do that?" Jerry says, and it's the best line in the episode. This is a significant development in the show's mythology, if you follow it. It suggests that some walkers are developing, that the biological stasis that has maintained the walker population in a functionally consistent state across 11 seasons might be changing, that the dead are, in some sense, learning, which raises questions about where that goes and what it means for the long-term viability of the walls people have been building, and whether the French scientists, who got further than anybody, were perhaps tracking exactly this kind of development. The main show ends without answering any of these questions. The variant walkers are introduced as a new threat. They create some drama in the final season, and then the series ends and the variants are passed forward to whatever the next chapter of this universe looks like. I have no idea whether anyone is planning to address this properly, but it's there, sitting in the show's final episodes, suggesting that 11 seasons in, the dead are not quite what anyone thought they were. Morales is a beautiful example of something the show does accidentally. Morales was in the original group, Atlanta, the camp, the CDC. He and his family chose to go to Birmingham rather than stick with Rick's group, in a scene that's genuinely affecting because it's two groups of survivors parting ways in a world where parting ways might mean never seeing each other again. And then he disappears for 7 seasons. 7 seasons of wondering what happened to the family that went to Birmingham. He comes back in season 8 in a single episode. He's a saviour now. His family's gone. Something happened to them, and whatever happened to them brought him here. He and Rick have a brief conversation that's charged with everything those 7 years represent. All the different versions of the world they've each experienced, all the choices they've each made, the enormous divergence between two people who were once in the same position at the same starting line. And then Daryl shoots him. He's dead. The conversation is over. And the show moves on as if it didn't just dispose of the most interesting, retrospective conversation it had set up all season. I'm not angry about this. I'm resigned to it. But Morales represents something the show consistently undervalues, which is the question of what the world looked like from the perspective of the people who made different choices at the beginning. Every group that split off, Morales, the Vartos at the nursing home in Atlanta, the various communities Rick encountered and then left behind, took a different road through the same apocalypse. Most of those roads are invisible to the viewer. Morales was the one moment where the show had an opportunity to look down one of those roads, even briefly, and it took the opportunity and then immediately put a crossbow bolt through it. Then there's Gabriel. Father Gabriel Stokes is introduced in season 5 as a priest who survived the early months of the outbreak by locking himself in his church and letting his congregation die outside the doors because he was afraid to open them. He has written, "Thou shalt not kill," in enormous letters on a page of his Bible, which he has been copying by hand. He is a man haunted by cowardice, who has committed himself to a principle as a way of atoning for what that cowardice cost. By the show's later seasons, Gabriel has killed people, more than once without visible hesitation, in situations where the show presents it as appropriate and then moves past it. The "Thou shalt not kill" page is presumably still in the Bible somewhere. No one has asked him about it. The transformation from the terrified priest in Season 5 to the cold and capable operator of Seasons 10 and 11 is the show's largest unacknowledged character shift. It's not unexplained. You can construct the explanation from events, but it's never reflected on, never paused over, never used as the basis for a conversation about what the man Gabriel started as would think of the man Gabriel became. Maybe that's realistic. Maybe people don't tend to audit themselves in apocalyptic conditions. But Gabriel's arc is the show's most complete portrait of someone whose stated moral framework was entirely dismantled by experience. And the show's silence on this dismantling is its own kind of statement about how durable moral commitments actually are. And then there's the title, The Walking Dead. You watch the show for a while, and you assume the title refers to the walkers. Obviously. They walk, they're dead. The title names them. But Robert Kirkman, who created the comic that the show's based on, said something in an interview early in the comic's run that changes this reading entirely. He said the title doesn't refer to the walkers. The dead are just dead. They're not really walking in any meaningful sense. They're just reanimating, which is a mechanical process without intent. The walking dead are the survivors, the people who are still going, still moving, still carrying their losses and their damage and their relationships and their hope forward into a world that has done its best to take all of those things from them. "We are the walking dead," is what Rick eventually says in the comics. It's a line that made it into the spin-off The Ones Who Live, where it serves as the show's thesis statement in its final moments. The living, the survivors, the people who are still putting one foot in front of the other. They are the walking dead. Not the shambling things outside the walls, the ones inside, keeping going. That's the show's secret, if it has one. Not the French Connection or the CRM or the A/B classification system or any of the mysteries we've been through tonight. The secret is that it was always about the living, about what it costs to stay alive and whether the cost is worth paying and what you hold on to so that the paying of it doesn't hollow you out entirely. The walkers are just the backdrop. The drama was always here inside the walls, between people who made it, and are trying to figure out what to do with that. Since we're still on the topic of threads and loose ends, let me mention a few more that I haven't found space for elsewhere tonight. Merle Dixon, Daryl's brother. Merle is the man left handcuffed to a pipe on a rooftop in Atlanta in the very first few episodes, because he was dangerous and the group couldn't manage him on the road. Rick leaves a hacksaw nearby. The last we see of him in Season 1, he's freed himself by cutting off his own hand. He disappears. He reappears in Season 3 at Woodbury, now with a bladed prosthetic and a deep hatred of the people who left him, and a role as the governor's enforcer. And then he dies at the end of Season 3, sacrificing himself in a way that neither entirely redeems him nor entirely doesn't. What I think about with Merle is the gap. Season 1 to Season 3. 2 seasons where Merle was out there somewhere, surviving alone with one hand, finding the governor's community, making himself useful, building a new role in a world where nothing from before applied. What did that look like? How did he get from the Atlanta rooftop to Woodbury? The show never tells us, and it never needed to, but the gap contains a whole story about a very specific kind of man in a very specific set of circumstances, and I'd watch that. And then there's Herschel, who I think deserves a mention even in a section about loose threads, because Herschel's faith is the show's most under-examined running argument. He was a believer from his first appearance to his last. The apocalypse didn't shake it. The loss of his farm didn't shake it. The death of his wife and the discovery that his barn full of walkers were people beyond saving. These things cost him visibly, but they didn't fundamentally alter what he was. He kept his Bible. He kept his perspective. He kept finding, in whatever circumstances the world produced, reasons to hold on to the framework that gave those circumstances meaning. The show treats Herschel with respect, but not with particular curiosity. It doesn't push on what it means for someone with his faith to live in this world, whether his framework changed to accommodate the world, or whether it was robust enough not to need to change. What the theology of universal reanimation actually looks like from inside a committed Christian worldview. These are not small questions. They're the questions that would matter most to someone like Herschel, and the show is content to let his faith be character colour rather than character content. The Commonwealth, in the show's final seasons, is the most ambitious thing the story attempts, an actual city, large enough to have social stratification and political intrigue, and a functioning press and a class of people who have enough security to worry about things other than immediate survival. It's an attempt to project forward, to show what the world survivors might build if given enough time and enough resources and enough stability. And it's an interesting place. The politics work, the class dynamics work, Pamela Milton as an antagonist works. What the Commonwealth doesn't quite do is ask the question that seems most urgent about it. What does it mean that this place exists, and that the survivors of Alexandria and the hilltop and the kingdom look at it and mostly can't live there? Rick's communities throughout the show are built on the specific experience of the road, on people who have paid the cost of what it takes to survive without walls. The Commonwealth was protected long enough that a significant portion of its population has only ever known what's inside the walls. The resulting difference in worldview, in values, in what people are willing to accept and what they'll fight against, is the show's most interesting, unresolved tension in its final seasons. And then it ends, and those questions go with it. There's also Dale Horvath, who's in the show for 2 seasons, and whose absence afterward is bigger than the show acknowledges. Dale is the group's conscience, explicitly, uncomplicatedly, with less internal contradiction than most of the show's other moral figures. He calls people on things. He refuses to pretend. When the group is discussing what to do with Randall, Dale is the only one who makes the full moral argument, who lays out everything, that abandoning their principles will cost them. They don't listen, and then a walker kills him that night, which the show frames as almost causally connected to the group's ethical failure, as if the universe noticed. What I think about with Dale is that the show killed him and then kept needing him. The moral voice he occupied doesn't get replaced cleanly. Herschel fills some of it, Rick occupies some of it, Glenn carries some of it. But the specific quality Dale had, the willingness to be inconvenient, to slow things down, to insist on the harder conversation when everyone else wanted to move past it, that quality is mostly absent from the show after season 2, and the story is occasionally less honest for it. Glenn's death in season 7 is the most discussed decision the show ever made about its own characters, and I'm not going to relitigate the debate about whether it was too far or correctly devastating or poorly handled or earned. What I want to note is the specific thing his death removed from the group. The person who had survived the most impossible situations through a combination of speed, ingenuity, and a specific quality of hope that functioned almost as a superpower. Glenn survived things he shouldn't have. Repeatedly, the show built this up as part of his character's identity, and then the show took it back, all at once, without the hope doing any good. There's a statement in that, about what hope is for and what it isn't for, and the show makes that statement and then moves on, and the characters move on. And 11 seasons later, you still feel the absence of Glenn Rhee in a way that the show itself sometimes seems surprised by. One thread I haven't mentioned yet, and it's one I genuinely find interesting even though the show itself moves past it quickly, is the hospital in season 5. Grady Memorial, Dawn Lerner runs it, A small force of officers, a functioning medical facility in Atlanta, real doctors, actual equipment. The pitch is, you come in injured, they treat you, you owe a debt of service, and you pay it off over time. In theory, given the circumstances, that's a reasonable exchange. In practice, it's a coercive system that Dawn perpetuates not because she's purely cruel, but because she's afraid. Afraid of her own officers, afraid of what happens to the equilibrium she's built if she appears weak. She knows the system is broken. She tells Beth as much. She's maintaining a terrible thing because she can't figure out how to stop without everything collapsing. And then her last act is reflexive. She pulls the trigger without meaning to, or claims not to mean to, and the hospital ends, and the show moves on. Grady Memorial is a whole argument about institutional capture compressed into 4 episodes, and the show doesn't quite have time to make it fully. But it's there. The show is full of things like that. Corners of the story where something genuinely worth examining is sitting, waiting, and the narrative tide moves through and past it before it can fully unfold. That's not a criticism, exactly. 11 seasons at the pace Walking Dead moved at doesn't leave room for everything, but it does mean the show rewards the kind of attention we've been paying tonight. The slow, late-night attention that follows a thread past where the episode left it and asks what's at the other end. Well, that's been a lot of Walking Dead for one evening, and I hope it's been the right kind of a lot. The kind that goes with the dark and the quiet, rather than against it. What I keep thinking about, when I think about this show in totality, is the specific combination of ambition and imperfection that it represents. It was never a perfect show. It had seasons that lost the plot in fairly spectacular fashion, storytelling decisions that frustrated and alienated people, a finale that was divisive in ways that extended well beyond the usual. It is also, across its best stretches, genuinely extraordinary television, a show that takes its premise seriously enough to ask what it actually means, that treats its characters as people with inner lives that persist through catastrophe, that is willing to sit with difficult questions rather than resolving them cleanly. The mysteries we talked about tonight, the infection that everyone carries, the French scientists who got further than anyone, the A's and B's and the helicopters, the things Carol knows about herself, the legitimacy Negan had despite everything, the philosophy that keeps breaking in Morgan's hands, the dead who chose to be dead, the man whose life pointed toward a truth he hadn't found yet. None of them have clean endings. Some of them never will. The show is done now, and the spin-offs are their own stories, and the French facility is not going to be explained. But the questions are good questions. And a story that asks good questions and then doesn't fully answer them is, in some ways, more honest than a story that answers everything cleanly. Life, which this show has always been at least partly about, doesn't resolve. It accumulates, it adds, and occasionally takes things away, and the people in the middle of it keep going and try to make sense of what they can and leave the rest. There's a scene very early in the show, season 4, after the prison falls, and Rick and Carl are on their own on the road. Rick is badly hurt. Carl is frightened in ways he's trying not to show. They find a house and shelter in it for a few days. And at a certain point, Carl, who is furious and scared and grieving and trying to figure out what he is now, that the thing he thought was safe is gone, says all of this to his father in a rush of honesty that exhausts both of them. And Rick doesn't have a good answer. He's barely conscious. He can't fix it. He just keeps breathing. And that's the show, really. Kept breathing. For 11 seasons and 177 episodes. Through the things it did well, and the things it did less well, and the decisions that cost it viewers, and the moments that proved why those viewers stayed for as long as they did. It kept breathing. What I find myself thinking about tonight, at this hour, is not the theories or the mysteries or any of the specific threads we've pulled on. It's the image of a man on a horse in an empty city. It's the image of a group of people standing at the edge of a highway in Georgia, arguing about which way to go, with absolutely no idea what 11 years of their own story looked like from outside. It's the image of a little girl in a pink hat, growing up in a world she has no frame of reference to miss, who turns out to be exactly what the world needed anyway. There's something about The Walking Dead at its best that functions like a late-night version of a very old story. Not a horror story, though it is one of those too, but the story about what people do when everything is taken from them. Whether they build something or break something, whether they find each other or retreat from each other, whether the thing they used to be survives the thing they have to become. That story has been told many times, in many forms, and Walking Dead's contribution to it is not the most polished or the most complete, but it is, in its strange way, one of the most honest. Because it doesn't let anyone off the hook. It doesn't resolve the argument. It keeps asking the question season after season, and lets the asking accumulate into something that feels, by the end, like a portrait of something true. I don't know what keeps you up at night, or what brought you here tonight specifically, but I'm glad you're here, and I hope the thinking felt good, and I hope wherever you are is warm and quiet. The walkers are outside, the walls are holding. That's enough for now. Good night. Sleep well.